Welcome back to another episode of Cape Ann Today. I am with our State Senator Bruce Tarr, as I often am, and we are going to talk about making the fishing industry and seafood processing energy efficient. You have a couple of ways of doing that, right?
Well, we do, Heather. And I think the most important thing to start the conversation is to say that the fishing industry is very interested in being energy efficient and in being good stewards of our climate. In fact, they suffer the consequences of climate change as much or more as anyone else, because we're seeing, and there was a report recently released about this, we are seeing dramatic changes in the warming of some of our ocean climate. And it is argued that the Gulf of Maine, where much of our groundfish comes from, is actually warming faster than almost any other body of water on the planet. So our commercial fishing industry, which depends on having a healthy ocean environment for spawning and reproduction and recruitment, those folks understand this keenly and they want to make a difference. But the difficulty is that when you're operating on thin margins and when it's difficult to get product to market and you're dealing with crushing federal regulations that limit your opportunity to fish and the amount of fish that you can bring to the dock, it's difficult to have the capital that's required to invest in things that make the processes more energy efficient, both in terms of harvesting and in terms of processing. And that's why, like so many initiatives for energy efficiency, this one does require some additional assistance. And the project that got federal assistance, most recently announced back in, I think it was January of this year, is something called the Energy Efficiency Initiative, Energy Efficient Fishing, EEF. And that project, which is a collaboration of a number of different entities that touch the fishing industry through the work of Senators Warren and Markey in the Omnibus Appropriations Act, was able to secure almost $2 million. It's sort of 1.9995 or something to that extent, but it's $2 million. And essentially what they are looking at doing is exploring all the ways that energy efficiency can be gained. And that might be in processing equipment, which oftentimes uses large amounts of electricity to accomplish what it needs to do. But an area that I think is going to be a little bit more elusive, but equally important, is the issue of vessel efficiency. You know, we have an aging fleet because the participants in the fishery have not had the resources to upgrade that fleet, number one. And number two, the regulations that govern fishing in New England also place some impediments toward upgrading a vessel. And that's something that, in my opinion, actually is going to need more work to talk about how we can allow people to change their vessels and modernize them. Now, that may sound odd. Someone might say, well, why would the government get in the way of that? The reason is when we started to see more intensive regulations, Amendment 5 and those kinds of changes to the fisheries management plan back in the early 90s, there was a concern that folks would increase their fishing power. And so they would come into the fishery with larger, more powerful vessels and increase their harvest in the face of limited days and limited places to fish. So it wasn't irrational. There was a reason that it was done. But now it's having very much, I would argue, unintended consequences. And if not unintended, certainly counterproductive. And so we need to look at the regulatory front. But this funding would go a long way in helping folks, at least in a pilot way, modernize their vessels. And the way that that most likely would happen first is with a change in their propulsion. Folks may not be able to afford getting an entirely new vessel, but they could upgrade the engine or the engines. And they could use engines that are more efficient, use newer technologies like fuel injection as opposed to carburation and other kinds of things. And so there's a lot of promise in moving forward with this. And I think it is very, very heartening to see the commercial fishing industry included in our overall initiatives to become more sustainable and more energy efficient.
How about what comes to mind right away are recreational vessels too? Is this industry turning over the way we're watching the car industry turn over, turning towards more energy efficient engines and Teslas and things like that?
So it's a great question. Before we get to it, though, I also want to point out that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is doing its part as well on this front. And Heather, back in December 13th of 2021, the governor signed a bill that I had amended to be able to ensure that fishing vessels and fishing equipment was included. And in that bill, there's $14 million for both fishing and farming to increase their efficiency and their energy efficiency. So the Commonwealth, a couple of years ago, largely using some federal money that we had gotten and some of our own state revenue, I would argue moved first on this. And then the federal government, thanks to the leadership of our 2 U.S. senators, is coming in with another $2 million. So I think we're moving in a very good direction here. So relative to the turnover, first of all, everything we've talked about so far is for the commercial fishing industry. There's nothing contemplated in either of these funding mechanisms for recreational vessels. However, recreational vessels are a concern as well. And there are manufacturers that are moving toward things that are boats that are propelled with electricity, with battery propulsion. There's also been some experimentation with alternative fuels. There has certainly been a lot of time spent in the recreational boat industry and looking at more fuel efficient hulls, hulls that plane more easily, hulls that cut through the water with less resistance. So there's a lot of activity going on there as well, but there has not been as much focus by government entities, either state, federal, or local, at trying to subsidize those efforts or try to push the industry in that direction. But my sense of the recreational boating industry, which is very important in Massachusetts, as it is to our country, is that there is a keen awareness of the responsibility there as well to contribute to solutions to sustainability and resilience. And so there are market-driven things happening. I think the big question in the recreational boating industry is going to be how much uptake is there? It's a different proposition when we talk about a vessel than when we talk about an automobile. If an automobile does run out of a charge, you pull to the side of the road and you get roadside assistance. If a vessel runs out of charge, it's a little bit different of a proposition. You still may be able to get assistance, but it's a different environment. And so there are a lot of issues here, but I would suggest that both the commercial sector and the recreational sector are moving in their own ways toward greater sustainability and greater energy conservation and efficiency.
Well, and I'm sorry to depart radically from these two grants that we were talking about, the $2 million from the federal government and the $14 million from the state.
Yes.
So let's return to that. Although what came to mind as you were talking right away was the fleet of boats, recreational boats at Wingersheet Beach on a Saturday afternoon. Mm-hmm. And suddenly I thought, wait a minute, that's an image, right? But let's return to this money. So,
but before we go there, I'm sorry to interrupt it, but I do want to point out that the recreational boating industry experienced a major change a number of years ago when there was a shift in production to more 4-stroke outboard engines as opposed to 2-stroke outboard engines. 4-stroke outboard engines do not consume oil in the combustion process. They have a crankcase, they have oil, but they don't burn it the way that a 2-stroke engine does. So in some ways, the recreational boating industry, because of the popularity of outboards, made a very significant step even before the commercial fishing industry in that shift. Now, you can still find 2-stroke outboard engines out there, but the shift to 4 strokes has been very pronounced and is very significant. Okay, now let's go back.
All right. Thank you for that. That's really informative. So let's talk about the practicality of these monies, and in terms of, so you talked about the fishing vessels and the ways they are propelled, and that changing and getting the fishermen getting support to change those mechanisms. But how about seafood processing? Because that's involved in these monies also.
So in seafood processing, there are a number of opportunities that I'm aware of, and there are probably more than that, that can help to gain efficiency. When you improve and modernize the electric motors that drive equipment, you can reduce consumption of electricity. When you change the layout and design of a processing facility, you can make it more efficient and cause it to consume less energy. And so those are just two ways that can be accomplished. And I'm sure if we talked about refrigeration and water flow and water management, those are two other ways, but I don't know as much about that. So the processing of fish can be an energy intensive operation. And that makes it a good place to look to try to improve efficiency. It's a place where investing money can yield significant gains. And I note that the collaborative that's been involved with the federal grant, the EEF grant, includes a lot of seafood processors, particularly those that are not far from here at the State House, down in Boston's Seaport District, where we have a lot of major processors. And a lot of those folks are directly involved in this process. And so they're offering input and they're working to see if there are ways that they can gain even more efficiency. So plenty of opportunity in processing as well.
So for the average Cape Ann citizen walking along Gloucester Harbor, is it possible to see evidence of these efforts happening?
Well, it will be. And so on the recreational side, I think it's more possible right now to see that, because you can see recreational vessels that are of a newer design and are being powered by more fuel efficient engines. I think it's a little harder at the moment to see it in terms of the commercial fishing industry, because we're just getting started. Because again, the issue of affordability and trying to help people gain access to those technologies. But I would predict that you will see that. And you can start to see that with some of the inshore fleet. You're seeing folks purchase new vessels that are of a newer design, that are using more lightweight materials, that are using lighter diesel engines. So if you look carefully, you might see that, but it might not be as obvious as it would be perhaps with the recreational sector.
And is this money, would there be like grant opportunities specifically to local fishermen to?
Yes.
So going right to the fishermen.
So one of the things that's important about the ways these funds are going to be administered is that they rely heavily on local organizations. So there's an offshoot of the Fishermen's Wives that's involved, the Massachusetts Fishermen's Partnership, other organizations that are going to help guide the distribution of these funds. And in fact, the grant of the federal funds was made to an umbrella of these various local organizations. And they're going to make sure that the money gets to the right place. And I think that's a wise thing to do, to have people that are in the industry, that are on the front lines of this, working to make sure the money gets spent in the most effective ways. And in this case of the Commonwealth, we are charging our Division of Marine Fisheries and our Division of Agricultural Resources with administering the funds, and they do so in consultation with those same groups. So there is an ongoing conversation here, and it's important that the conversation includes many, if not all, of the same people, so that the federal money is not used in a way that's duplicative of the way the state money is used, and they can work together for synergy to make as much progress as we possibly can.
All right, I have one last question about seafood processing. What is happening in the Steve Connolly building?
So I'm not prepared to give a good answer to that. Maybe on our next week's show, Heather, I'll do some research. But I would say that, that is an important building. I know that there is one local family that harvests and processes lobster that has been operating out of that building. They do a phenomenal job. And I hope that we're going to see more of that type of thing in that building, because it's strategically important. It's the Browns that are operating that, and I hope we'll see more of that kind of activity at that location, because obviously the loss of Conley's was very significant. But if it can be followed on by local folks processing and harvesting, then that will make that loss much easier to take. And in fact, in the end, it may not be a loss at all in terms of activity on the waterfront.
No, Steve Connolly's was wonderful. And I have to say, the people who work there were just as great as the fish.
Yeah.
Anything else that you think I'm missing about this conversation, on the federal and state money to these fisheries?
I think we've covered it fairly well. I would stress that it's a work in progress, that this is an area where a lot of folks in the commercial sector have wanted to go for quite a while, but they've been constrained by the lack of access to capital for these kind of things, and by some regulation. There is some flexibility in the regulation that may not be obvious, but those two factors have held people back. But now we're beginning to really move forward in a concerted way. And I think it's very significant, particularly as Gloucester, the oldest fishing port in the nation, is moving forward, celebrating 400 years. All of those 400 years have been characterized by innovation in the fishing industry, whether it would be using different gear types or different kinds of vessels or different kinds of processing. And now Gloucester is poised to once again, as it enters its 401st year, to be able to lead the country in terms of efficiency and sustainability. So I actually think it's pretty exciting, but I also think we're at the tip of the iceberg.
All right, well, let's change gears a little bit. I understand the governor has signed an important piece of legislation.
So the governor has filed with us a closeout supplemental budget, which essentially would enable us to close the books on the fiscal year that ended on July 1st. And it's about a $2.15 billion bill, but it allocates federal money. So the net cost to the state is in the neighborhood of $800 to $900 million, but the total price tag on the bill is about $2.15 billion. And the thing that's been attracting early attention in that bill is the $250 million appropriation to expand the Massachusetts shelter system, which is being necessitated by the influx of migrants that we have, and our shelter system being overwhelmed beyond its capacity. And I think we've all seen in the various news reports about how much of a challenge that has been. And so the governor is seeking $250 million additional dollars to try to address that. In that supplemental budget, there are also funding for collective bargaining, some additional funding for our sheriffs who have shortfalls in their accounts, and a number of other things. But one thing, Heather, that is not in this filing, and it's something that I intend to work on to try to change, is funding for our communities that have been adversely affected by severe storm events that have not been eligible for federal funding. One thing we don't want to do as state government is spend money that could be spent by the federal government through the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the federal infrastructure for dealing with disasters. But in those cases, and we've had some, where we have communities that are not eligible for the federal funding, we need to do something. And so we're going to be looking at this bill carefully to see if there's an opportunity there. And we're also going to be looking at this bill to see if there's any way that we can advance the tax reform package that's been stuck now in a conference committee for several months. And the governor, in her filing letter, which I have right here, mentions that while it is not in the bill, she considers it a priority for us not to forget that tax relief package and to get that done as well. And she and I have had conversations about that, and I'm hoping that we're going to be able to advance that priority even as we're also working on this supplemental spending bill.
Well, and I'm sorry, I misspoke. I said she signed it and she just filed it. So sorry about that.
You know, Heather, it's an easy mistake to make. She signed the filing letter and she filed it with us, and it will probably be over the next few weeks where she'll get to sign some version of what she filed with us. But there is a long way to go between here and there, given all of the circumstances that are out there.
Well, what else should we know this week on Human Health?
Well, I think that one thing we should be grateful for is that we faced a hurricane that could have done extensive damage across the region. And it did do some damage. We had trees down and some coastal erosion, but it was not as bad as it could have been. And I think it was a reminder for all of us that we need to keep working toward sustainability and adaptation. And one thing that's been happening a little bit to our north in the Merrimack River region is a very, very intensive discussion about how we could do better in getting permits to do emergency work in the face of a hurricane. We actually did get some to put sand on Salisbury Beach, And there was no need for that sand at Newburyport because we had put some sand there from the dredging project of the Merrimack River. But the discussion nonetheless is important. How can we make sure that two things happen when an emergency is approaching? Number one, we get permission to be able to do what needs to be done. But number two, there's proper monitoring and engineering for what is done so it doesn't wind up doing more damage than what would have happened if we didn't do it in the first place. And that's a discussion that needs to be ongoing. I'm actually very pleased with the discussions that we've had with the Secretary of Environmental Affairs, the folks at DEP and CZM and all the state agencies. So while this hurricane did not do as much damage as it could have, it served as a very valuable prompt for all of us to re-intensify our conversations about emergency preparedness.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Heather.
Interested in a sponsorship? Email sponsor@1623studios.org to learn more.